The gray envelope my father-in-law slipped into my uniform pocket felt entirely too thick to be a standard sympathy card. Its sharp, rigid edge pressed uncomfortably through the dark wool of my army dress jacket, leaving a cold, concentrated weight against my ribs. The suffocating scent of funeral lilies and heavy floor wax filled the crowded parlor, but underneath that overwhelming sweetness, I could smell the stale scotch Arthur had been drinking since 10 o'clock this morning. The old man leaned in close, his breath ragged and warm against my ear, and whispered a single directive for me not to let my husband know about what he had just given me. Across the dimly lit room, Eric stood right in the center of a tragic tableau, absorbing the attention of every guest who walked through the double doors. The man I had been married to for 18 years was playing the role of the shattered, devoted father to absolute perfection. His shoulders slumped forward just enough to look physically broken by grief, and his voice dropped to a soft, devastating murmur as he accepted the endless stream of condolences from his corporate coworkers. I squeezed the small cotton handkerchief in my right hand, focusing my entire mind on the faint trace of my daughter's lavender laundry detergent still clinging to the fabric. It was the only real thing in a room completely packed with practiced sorrow. My commanding officers had trained me for over a decade never to fire a weapon without positive identification of the target. Today, standing just a few feet away from Chloe's closed casket, I did not have all the evidence yet, but I knew with absolute certainty that my marriage was already dead. An older aunt on Eric's side of the family stepped past me, her heavy, expensive perfume masking the lilies for a brief, dizzying second. She patted my husband's arm affectionately, deliberately turning her back to my side of the aisle, and murmured softly to him. I heard every single word she said. She told him that at least he had been there when it mattered, and that the army was always taking me away from the family anyway. I did not correct her. Too did not raise my voice to explain that my phone had been secured under exercise protocol, that Eric had been given the emergency operations desk number, and that he had never called it. I filed her cruel words away, letting the injustice burn a quiet, contained hole in my stomach. The crowd of mourners parted slightly, and Eric finally made his way over to where I stood strictly at attention. He placed a hand heavily on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my collarbone hard enough to send a clear, physical warning to maintain our picture of marital unity. He smelled of strong black coffee and expensive cologne, a sharp, vibrant contrast to the deep exhaustion he had painted across his face. As he adjusted his dark suit cuffs, a heavy gold watch caught the muted, amber light of the funeral home. It was a brand new timepiece, a recent and highly personal gift from a woman named Vanessa, a detail I had noted weeks ago but kept strictly to myself. Looking down at his polished black dress shoes, I noticed a tiny streak of pale, crusty sand clinging to the leather welt. We lived in North Carolina, hours away from the coastline, and my husband was supposed to have been at home all week, frantically coordinating with the overseas hospital to save our child. Eric leaned close to my ear, his tones smoothly shifting into that gentle, managing voice he always reserved for public spaces. "We need to look like a family right now, Danny," he whispered, his breath hot against my cheek. "We have to be strong for Chloe." "I am standing right here," I replied, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of the tears he expected. He patted my arm in a patronizing rhythm. "There are a few insurance claim forms waiting at the house," he continued, not missing a single beat of his agenda. "I want you to sign them tonight so I can handle the practical things while you rest. You are too emotional to deal with financial paperwork right now." My jaw ached intensely from grinding my teeth together. Our 19-year-old daughter was not even in the ground yet, and the grieving father was already organizing the massive insurance payout. I forced myself to take a slow, measured breath before giving him an answer. "I am not signing anything tonight, Eric, or tomorrow." Before he could push the issue further and cause a scene, Arthur shifted his weight nervously beside us, his polished shoes scuffing loudly against the hardwood floor. Eric noticed the awkward movement immediately, his eyes narrowing sharply as he focused on the small space between his father and me. "What did you just hand her?" Eric asked, his voice suddenly carrying a cold, subtle edge of suspicion that completely ruined his gentle morning father routine. I pulled Chloe's white handkerchief from my outer pocket and held it where Eric could see it. "Something of hers," I said. The words were true, but they did not answer what he had really asked. I kept my eyes on his while the gray envelope remained hidden against my ribs. Eric studied his father's face for a long, agonizing moment, searching ruthlessly for a crack in the story. The older man swallowed hard, clearly terrified of his own son. But then Arthur pointed a shaking finger toward the entrance and loudly mentioned the local press gathering on the front steps. The sudden change in subject distracted my husband just long enough to break his interrogation. Eric turned his attention to the cameras outside, leaving the envelope safe against my ribs. When the lengthy funeral service finally concluded, Eric fully expected me to get into the passenger seat of his car and head back to the large suburban house we had shared for almost 2 decades. I told him I needed one night completely alone to process the burial, and before he could formulate a reasonable argument, I turned and walked to my own vehicle. I did not drive to a local hotel, nor did I seek out a sympathetic friend's guest room. Instead, I drove 30 minutes toward the military base, navigating the familiar autumn roads until I pulled into the quiet parking lot of a modest brick apartment building. I walked up the concrete stairs and unlocked the deadbolt of Unit 4 with a brass key my husband did not know existed. The small living room inside was perfectly quiet, empty except for a few neatly stacked boxes, my spare military uniforms hanging in the open closet, and a framed photograph of Chloe smiling on her last birthday. I had signed the lease on this place 6 months ago. This apartment was never a frantic escape plan thrown together in the chaotic wake of a sudden family tragedy. It was a carefully constructed exit strategy, completely funded by a separate bank account I had opened legally and documented thoroughly with a financial advisor. I set my car keys on the narrow kitchen counter, walked directly over to the locked metal cabinet in the corner, and pulled out my heavy continuity binder. My husband had always mocked me for keeping that binder. He loved to joke at dinner parties that I lived my life as if a massive disaster was always imminent. He called it my military paranoia. I called it standard operating procedure. Now, that same binder held every bank statement, every strange credit inquiry, and every piece of paper that proved my marriage had been a financial illusion for months. My hands shook slightly as I sat down at the small dining table, the absolute silence of the room pressing heavily against my eardrums. I reached deep into my uniform jacket pocket and pulled out the thick gray envelope, setting it down on the scratched wooden table like it was a live explosive device. Inside the heavy paper, I found a small black USB drive and a single printed sheet containing an internal corporate audit alert. I ignored the paper for now, opening my personal laptop instead. It was a secure device, completely disconnected from any wireless network to prevent remote access or tracking. I plugged the small drive into the side port. A single audio file instantly appeared on the screen, labeled only with a string of numbers that I quickly recognized as the exact date of my daughter's death. I clicked play, turning the laptop volume up high enough to fill every corner of the empty apartment. The recording started with the frantic, echoing background noise of a busy emergency room, followed by the crisp, highly urgent voice of a hospital coordinator calling from Portugal. The woman explained in heavily accented English that the young female patient was suffering from massive internal bleeding following a severe vehicle accident on a coastal road. She stated clearly that the medical team needed to execute an immediate transfer to a specialized private surgical facility in Lisbon. "We require a security deposit equivalent to $8,000 to authorize the transport vehicle," the coordinator said, her tone remaining professional but laced with a clear, undeniable undercurrent of panic. "The current facility cannot handle this level of severe trauma. We need the funds cleared to dispatch the surgical team." A heavy, terrifying block of static stretched across the audio track. Sitting in my quiet kitchen, my chest tightened until drawing a regular breath became a deeply painful effort. I waited for my husband to authorize the emergency payment, to scream at them, to save our child, to do literally anything a desperate parent should do in the darkest moment of their life. I knew the money was sitting in our joint emergency account. I knew he had full access to it from his phone. I had seen the balance myself just weeks prior. The coordinator's voice returned to the line, breaking the agonizing silence. "Sir, you must understand the strict timeline here. If we do not move her to surgery immediately, by morning, your daughter may not survive the injuries." Another incredibly long pause followed, filled only with the faint, rhythmic sound of a keyboard typing in the background. It was the sound of a man casually working on other business while his child bled out across the ocean. Then, Eric's voice finally came through the small laptop speakers. He did not sound afraid. He did not sound frantic or broken. He sounded remarkably calm, completely steady, and utterly focused on his own priorities. "The money stays in escrow," he said. The agonizing silence in the apartment stretched out long after the laptop speakers clicked off, leaving me entirely alone with the ghost of my husband's voice. That single calculated sentence about keeping the money in escrow did not break my heart tonight. My heart had already begun breaking 10 months earlier, cracking under the weight of 1,000 tiny, deliberate lies. It started on a Tuesday, in early December. I sat in a cramped, windowless office at Fort Bragg, staring at a printed transfer authorization under the harsh fluorescent lights. The proposed assignment offered a significant pay raise and a highly prestigious medical planning command, but it required relocating our entire family to a military base in Germany. I brought the crisp white paper home and laid it flat on our granite kitchen island. Chloe looked down at the document, her bright hazel eyes trying desperately to hide a sudden flicker of absolute dread. My daughter immediately told me she would be perfectly fine moving halfway across the world right before her senior year of high school. I recognized the brave, tight smile she always wore when she was trying to protect my feelings, and I knew she was terrified of losing her friends. I declined the promotion the very next morning without a second thought. A week later, we were having dinner with Eric's parents in their formal dining room. His mother, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, casually asked about my career progression and the upcoming promotions board. Eric reached across the linen tablecloth, poured himself another glass, and let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. He looked his mother right in the eye and told her the review board simply had not selected me, framing the entire situation as a tragic professional failure on my part. The sheer audacity of the lie stole the breath right out of my lungs. I felt the heat rise sharply in my cheeks, my fingernails digging into the palms of my hands under the table. I did not start a screaming match over the prime rib. I did not defend myself or call him a liar in front of his family. Instead, I went upstairs later that night, printed the original military assignment offer, and placed it into a brand new black binder. That was the very first page. The thick binder quickly grew heavier as the weeks passed. 18 years of marriage had slowly devolved into a quiet financial dictatorship, and I was finally starting to pay close attention to the locked doors. I logged into our joint banking portal a few weeks after the dinner party and noticed a strange, unapproved pending transfer originating from our emergency savings account. When I asked Eric about the missing funds in the hallway, he rolled his eyes and let out a sharp, condescending laugh. The man I had loved for almost 2 decades called it a temporary investment, mocking me loudly for turning our sacred marriage into a hostile corporate audit. His voice echoed off the high ceilings as he told me I was acting completely paranoid. I did not argue with his aggressive diagnosis. I simply walked back to my desk, downloaded the official bank statement, wrote the exact date and the amount in the margins, and filed the paper away. That same evening, I ran a comprehensive credit report on myself and found a hard inquiry from a limited liability company I did not recognize at all. Something was moving beneath the surface of our life, and I needed to know exactly what it was. I scheduled a private meeting with Maya Torres the following Monday, using the pretense of seeking pre-deployment financial advice to leave the house undetected. Maya sat across a polished mahogany desk in her downtown office, carefully examining the small stack of papers I had brought. The faint smell of fresh coffee and old legal books filled the room, grounding me in the stark reality of my situation. She explained very clearly that opening a separate bank account to protect my future military pay was completely legal and highly recommended. However, the sharp attorney firmly warned me against hiding joint assets or unilaterally splitting our shared emergency fund before filing formal divorce papers. Doing so would immediately alert my husband and give him the perfect opportunity to accuse me of hiding marital property in a court of law. Maya advised me to keep paying my exact portion of the household bills and to leave Chloe's emergency medical and travel funds entirely untouched unless a true crisis occurred. I agreed to her strict terms, quietly establishing my own private checking account that same afternoon and placing a total security freeze on my personal credit line. I chose not to file for divorce right then because Chloe was busy preparing to leave for a marine conservation program in Portugal, and I desperately wanted to preserve her peace of mind for one more year. Preparing for that overseas trip became our final, beautiful project together. Chloe sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor of her bedroom, surrounded by expensive dive gear, colorful travel guides, and piles of summer clothes. My daughter caught me sliding a freshly printed copy of her flight itinerary into the black folder and laughed out loud. A rolled-up pair of wool socks hit my shoulder, thrown playfully, as she teased me that not every single family vacation had to be treated like a tactical, military operation. I caught the soft socks and smiled back, telling her that the things worth protecting always deserved a solid backup plan. My beautiful girl rolled her eyes, reminding me that her father had explicitly promised to handle all the emergency contact registrations and the final travel insurance payments. I wanted to log into his laptop and verify every single detail myself, trusting nothing he said anymore. But Chloe reached out, touching my arm lightly, and asked me to just trust him this one time. She wanted him to be the reliable parent he constantly claimed to be. I swallowed my heavy anxiety and agreed to step back, though I quietly kept a duplicate copy of her flight schedule tucked inside my own desk drawer. That same week, I used the protected money from my new, legally declared account to sign a lease on the small brick apartment near the military base. The space was nothing more than a quiet, empty room with scuffed hardwood floors and cheap plastic blinds, but stepping inside felt incredibly safe. I spent a few hours every weekend meticulously moving small, irreplaceable items out of our large suburban house. I relocated my original birth certificate, my military commendation medals, and a chipped ceramic coffee mug Chloe had painted for me in the 3rd grade. I placed the heavy continuity binder into a gray metal cabinet and locked it securely with a heavy brass padlock. I was not a weak, defeated woman fleeing into the night. I was a trained officer systematically securing a fallback position, ensuring I had a place to stand when the war finally started. The cracks in Eric's carefully constructed double life were becoming impossible for him to hide, no matter how smoothly he spoke. We were driving home from the grocery store on a rainy Tuesday when his cell phone automatically connected to the car's audio display. The dashboard screen illuminated brightly, flashing an incoming call from someone named Vanessa Cole, accompanied by a glossy architectural rendering of a modern beachfront property. Eric quickly canceled the call, his thumb jabbing frantically at the steering wheel button, his breathing hitching for just a fraction of a second. He cleared his throat and smoothly explained that Vanessa was just a new corporate client looking for lucrative property investments. The heavy rain drummed against the windshield, filling the tense silence between us. I kept my eyes fixed on the wet asphalt ahead, nodding slowly as if I believed every single word falling from his mouth. As soon as I parked the car in our garage and he went inside, I pulled out my phone and cross-referenced her name with the strange credit inquiry I had found weeks earlier. Public records are incredibly unforgiving. The limited liability company was registered directly to Vanessa, and the formation documents had been signed exactly 2 weeks prior. The scattered pieces were assembling themselves into a terrifying picture, but the most damning piece of evidence arrived shortly before Chloe boarded her flight to Europe. I opened the joint emergency account portal late at night to verify her travel funds one last time. Exactly $8,000 was missing from the available balance. The digital ledger showed a completed wire transfer, and the memo line contained only 3 chilling words. It read, Seabright Escrow LLC. I immediately drafted a sterile, highly professional email to Eric, demanding a written explanation for the unauthorized withdrawal. The money miraculously reappeared in the account the very next morning. My husband replied to the email with a casual, dismissive apology blaming a temporary banking glitch and an overly aggressive automated transfer system. He expected me to drop the issue completely and move on. I did not argue with him. I printed both the withdrawal confirmation and the subsequent deposit receipt, sliding them into the binder side by side. I took a thick black pen and wrote a heavy note across the top margin of the paper. Reversed does not mean resolved. That reversed bank transaction haunted my thoughts for weeks, but the real catastrophe required perfect timing to execute. Handing over my personal cell phone was standard protocol for a restricted military field exercise. The heavy plastic security bin rattled as dozens of devices hit the bottom. Before surrendering my connection to the outside world, the humid North Carolina morning air clung to my skin like a wet towel. Standing in our driveway, the gravel crunching under my combat boots, I handed Eric a laminated card containing the unit operations desk number and the direct line for international SOS. My husband took a slow sip of his black coffee, his jaw tightening in obvious annoyance. His posture screamed impatience. He hated my military preparation, constantly complaining that my contingency plans ruined the peaceful flow of our family life. My fingers quickly typed out one final text message to our daughter in Portugal. Call the emergency line if you need me, any hour. A tiny green check mark appeared on the screen. She received it. She never had the chance to read it. The official accident report, now secured safely inside my metal cabinet, documented the violent timeline with clinical precision. At 2:35 in the afternoon on the East Coast, which translated to 7:35 in the evening along the rocky Portuguese coast, the programmed transport vehicle lost traction on a wet coastal road. The metal frame crumpled against a stone barrier. Chloe survived the initial devastating impact. My brave, beautiful girl stayed conscious just long enough to give the paramedics her father's mobile number. She trusted the forms he had explicitly promised to update. She trusted him. 37 agonizing minutes later, the hospital coordinator dialed his phone. 3:12 in the afternoon. Sitting in my quiet apartment hours after the funeral, listening to the stolen audio file on loop, I could finally hear the exact mechanics of his betrayal. The coordinator carefully explained the massive internal bleeding and the absolute necessity of a private surgical transfer. Her voice carried a sharp, undeniable urgency as she demanded a security deposit equivalent to $8,000. It was the exact amount he had tested sending to his mistress 2 weeks prior. The precise sum sitting available in our joint emergency fund. A faint, feminine whisper echoed in the background of the recording. Vanessa was sitting right next to him. The environmental noise on the audio track featured the distinct sound of a heavy stapler and the rustle of thick legal documents. They were sitting inside a closing office, finalizing the paperwork for the beach house, while my daughter bled out on a foreign gurney. "Can the transfer wait until tomorrow morning?" Eric asked the coordinator, his tone completely steady and conversational. The medical professional firmly warned him that a delay would prove entirely fatal. He possessed the money. He held the direct number to my military command post. He deliberately chose to use neither. Instead of calling for a military emergency relay, my husband stalled for time. He demanded additional paperwork from the overseas doctors, actively burning through Chloe's desperately narrow window of survival. The bank statement locked in my binder told the rest of the sinister story. At 3:31 in the afternoon, the digital ledger recorded a massive outbound wire. $8,000 permanently left our savings and landed directly in the account of Seabright Escrow. Eric purchased his coastal investment property while our only child waited for a surgical transport vehicle that would never arrive. My field exercise finally concluded at 5:45. The humid air inside the canvas command tent smelled heavily of ozone, burnt coffee, and unwashed uniforms. A junior officer walked down the line, handing back the heavy plastic bin of confiscated personal devices. My phone screen instantly illuminated with a terrifying barrage of missed calls from the overseas program director, the foreign hospital, and Arthur. The military operations desk had completely empty logs for the day. Eric had never even attempted to reach my commanders. Dialing the international number required 3 separate attempts with my violently shaking fingers. The exact same coordinator from the audio file answered the line. Her voice sounded remarkably heavy, completely hollowed out by professional defeat. She informed me that the young American patient had passed away at 10:02 at night, local time. 5:02 in the afternoon in North Carolina. Barely 45 minutes before they handed my phone back to me. All ambient sound inside the busy command tent immediately vanished. The loud chatter of soldiers packing up heavy tactical gear muted into a ringing, absolute silence. A cold, suffocating weight dropped into my stomach, spreading a terrible prickly numbness down both of my arms and into my fingertips. The phone slipped slightly in my slick grip. My brain mechanically processed the horrific timeline, forcing my mouth to ask for the exact hour of the first call and the precise time of death. A fellow officer noticed my stark white knuckles and empty stare. Strong hands grabbed my shoulders, guiding me toward a folding metal chair before my knees buckled. They drove me home because my legs completely refused to operate the pedals of a vehicle. Eric called me less than an hour later. His voice broke into dramatic, heaving sobs as he spun his very first elaborate lie. "I tried to call your command post, Danny," he cried into the receiver, his breath catching perfectly to simulate panic. "They wouldn't put me through. The hospital didn't give me enough time to get the money." "I understand," I whispered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Sitting on our living room sofa, still wearing my dusty uniform, I listened to his flawless performance without arguing. My analytical mind was already categorizing the massive discrepancies. Later that same night, after the family doctor prescribed Eric a heavy sedative and he finally fell asleep in the dark guest room, I opened my personal laptop. The bank portal clearly displayed the completed wire transfer to the escrow company. The timestamp mocked me from the glowing screen. 3:31. The exact window when Chloe was begging for a surgeon. I placed the printed hospital call log directly next to the bank statement on the cold granite kitchen counter. The terrifying geometry of his betrayal aligned perfectly. Then, a sudden bright light broke the darkness of the room. Eric's cell phone vibrated silently on the edge of the island, illuminating the glass screen with a new message preview from Vanessa. The text contained 2 devastating sentences. "The house is safe. Delete the hospital messages." The silence in my apartment pressed painfully against my eardrums after the audio file abruptly ended. The recording cut off right after my husband declared that the money would stay in escrow, clipping a faint, feminine voice in the background before the file went completely dead. My hands hovered over the laptop keyboard, trembling just enough to make the plastic keys rattle. Arthur had not given me the complete conversation. The old man was still protecting the company, providing just enough information to clear his own conscience without handing me the weapon to destroy his son entirely. I did not scream or throw the small black drive against the wall. Instead, I carefully dragged the digital file into a new secure folder, logging the exact time of the transfer to preserve the chain of custody. Next, I turned my attention back to the thick gray envelope resting on my kitchen table. Reaching inside the heavy paper, my fingers brushed against a small stack of folded documents. The first page was an internal corporate audit alert, printed on company letterhead and highlighting my daughter's life insurance policy number. Beneath that alert lay a crisp photocopy of a beneficiary change form, bearing a signature that looked exactly like Chloe's handwriting. A small yellow sticky note clung to the bottom corner of the page. Arthur had scribbled a single sentence in frantic, slanted ink. This was not in the system before she died. My chest tightened as I slid the final item out of the envelope. It was a heavy cardstock business card belonging to Lena Brooks, a lead investigator for the Special Investigations Unit at the insurance firm. No formal criminal charges existed yet. Arthur had simply handed me a trail of breadcrumbs, hoping I would follow them quietly and handle the family mess behind closed doors. I opened my heavy continuity binder and flipped directly to the financial section. The original insurance policy, securely filed away 3 years ago, listed Eric and me as equal beneficiaries, splitting the $250,000 exactly in half. The new document from the envelope allocated 100% of the payout directly to my husband. Staring closely at the copied signature, my eyes caught a strange anomaly in the ink pattern. The sweeping tail of the letter E dipped perfectly below the signature line, matching the exact angle and pressure of a college tuition authorization form I had scanned into my military files last year. I did not immediately declare the document a forgery to anyone. I simply placed a red sticky flag on the page and closed the binder, letting the quiet hum of the apartment refrigerator anchor my racing thoughts. My cell phone vibrated on the table, shattering the fragile silence. Eric's name flashed across the screen. Taking a deep breath, I answered the call and pressed the device to my ear. "Danny, sweetie, we really need to get this paperwork finished." His voice drifted through the speaker, dripping with manufactured, gentle concern. "The funeral home requires the final payment by Friday, and the claim forms need your signature of no contest before the insurer will release the funds." "I am still going through the documents," I replied, keeping my tone entirely neutral. The practiced sweetness in his voice instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp edge of frustration. "You are making everything so much harder than it has to be, especially after what happened to Chloe. People are going to wonder why a grieving mother is trying to fight over money right now." He wanted me to feel ashamed. The man who had bought a beach house while our child bled out was lecturing me about the optics of maternal grief. "I will review the papers when I am ready," I said, and ended the call before he could launch another manipulative attack. The very next morning, I carried the gray envelope in my binder into Maya Torres's downtown office. The sharp attorney examined the copied beneficiary form, her manicured fingernails tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the polished mahogany desk. She explicitly warned me against confronting my husband directly, posting any accusations online, or attempting to access his corporate accounts. Emotional outbursts would only allow his defense team to paint me as an unstable, vindictive spouse trying to steal his inheritance. "We do not need to fight him in the mud," Maya explained, pulling a fresh legal pad from her drawer. "I am sending formal preservation notices today. The insurance company, his bank, his cellular carrier, the escrow firm, and the building management office will be instructed to retain the records they control. If Eric tries to destroy evidence after receiving notice of the dispute, that attempt can create serious consequences of its own." She dialed the phone number on the business card Arthur had provided, placing the call on speaker so I could listen. Lena Brooks answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and deeply professional. The investigator confirmed that the disputed beneficiary form carried a date stamp from exactly 6 weeks ago. However, the internal system receipt told a completely different story, unraveling the timeline my husband had carefully constructed. The metadata shows the file was actually uploaded into our server late Tuesday night, Lena stated, the rustling of paper audible through the speakerphone. That upload occurred several hours after your daughter passed away. The leather chair squeaked as I leaned forward, my hands gripping the wooden armrests. Are they going to pay him the money? The claim is currently flagged in our system, the investigator replied smoothly. The funds are not moving anywhere. But your husband has already initiated the formal payout process. What happens if he has not submitted the final sworn confirmation yet? I asked, my mind racing through the legal implications of the pending paperwork. Lena let out a slow, measured breath over the line. Then we wait and see whether he chooses to lie under oath. Leaving the law office, the bright afternoon sun felt incredibly heavy on my shoulders. I walked back to my car, knowing that the trap was fully set, waiting only for Eric to take the final step. I spent the rest of the evening in my quiet apartment, organizing my military records and reviewing the preservation checklist Maya had provided. The relevant companies were now on formal notice to preserve the records they controlled. Eric could still try to delete information from his own devices, but he could no longer assume that deletion would erase server backups, carrier logs, access records, or audit history. The hours dragged by, filled with the dull ache of an empty room and the relentless ticking of the kitchen clock. Sleep felt entirely impossible. I sat at the small dining table, drinking cold coffee, and watching the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. My phone lit up again well past midnight, vibrating aggressively against the wood. The caller identification displayed Maya's personal number. I answered immediately, the cold plastic of the phone pressing against my cheek. Lena just called me, my attorney said, her voice dropping an octave in the quiet night. Your husband logged into the portal 10 minutes ago. He submitted the electronic claim. I closed my eyes, picturing him sitting in his home office, confidently clicking a button that would finalize his theft and secure his new life with Vanessa. Did he sign the declaration? He checked the box confirming that Chloe signed the form herself and that all documents were completed while she was still alive, Maya confirmed, the heavy silence of the night wrapping tightly around her words. He just made it official. The smear campaign started before the sun even came up. My cell phone vibrated aggressively across the wooden nightstand, rattling against a glass of stale water and pulling me out of a restless, fragmented sleep. The bright screen illuminated the dark apartment, displaying my mother-in-law's contact photo. I answered the call, bracing myself for the inevitable impact. Her voice came through the speaker, thick with dramatic tears and sharp with undeniable venom. She loudly accused me of dishonoring Chloe's memory, claiming my refusal to release the insurance funds was a disgusting display of maternal greed. A younger cousin posted a lengthy paragraph on a social media network exactly 20 minutes later, heavily hinting that an absent military mother was now trying to steal a grieving father's only financial lifeline to pay for a secret apartment. Eric did not post anything himself. The man maintained his perfect public facade of a broken, peaceful husband, letting his loyal relatives do the dirty work of destroying my reputation. I did not type out a furious reply or defend myself in the comments section. Instead, I pressed the side buttons on my device, capturing digital screenshots of every single accusation, carefully noting the timestamps and filing them away. The digital abuse burned my chest, but I refused to give them the emotional reaction they desperately wanted. Carrying my heavy continuity binder into a sterile corporate conference room later that morning felt exactly like walking into a hostile combat briefing. Lena Brooks sat at the head of a long glass table, her posture rigid in a tailored navy suit. The lead insurance investigator regarded me with a healthy dose of professional skepticism. My obvious financial interest in the $250,000 policy made me a natural suspect in any dispute, and Eric had already planted the narrative that I was a vindictive, estranged wife. Setting the thick binder on the glass surface, I unhooked the metal rings and opened it to the very first tab. Lena carefully reviewed the neatly logged bank statements, the printed emails from my military command, and the credit inquiries dating back 10 full months before the accident. Her skeptical expression slowly shifted into a look of quiet, dawning realization. The chronological records proved beyond any doubt that my documentation began long before a tragic car crash could provide a convenient cover story. The meticulous timeline connected the coastal property formation directly to the missing emergency funds, completely destroying my husband's claim that I was acting out of sudden grief. A forensic document examiner joined our meeting via a secure video link, sharing his computer screen on the large monitor mounted to the conference room wall. He placed the disputed beneficiary form directly next to the college tuition authorization I had scanned the previous year. Looking at the two signatures side by side with the naked eye was not enough to confirm fraud, but the digital metadata told an absolute, undeniable truth. The examiner highlighted a specific transparency layer within the electronic file, demonstrating exactly how the image of my daughter's signature had been copied and pasted from the older document. Software history logs pointed straight to a corporate laptop issued exclusively to my husband. Chloe had never logged into that secure system. She had never received a multi-factor authentication text message on her phone, and she certainly had not signed a new legal contract from a hospital bed in Portugal. The conversation quickly shifted to the network access logs. Securing a digital signature inside the corporate portal required a physical hardware token, and the audit trail clearly showed that Arthur's executive account had been used to bypass the standard security protocols. The old man was sitting at the far end of the conference table, his shoulders hunched forward, staring intensely at his trembling hands. Arthur quietly admitted that Eric knew his personal identification number. My husband had memorized the 6-digit code months ago while helping his father log into the network after a minor hand surgery. The older man swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper, as he confessed to noticing his security token sitting in the wrong desk drawer the morning after Chloe died. He had convinced himself it was just a lapse in his own memory, choosing to ignore the terrifying implication because acknowledging it would destroy his son. Heat flared in my chest, a sudden, blinding anger directed right at my father-in-law. His lifetime of turning a blind eye and protecting the family reputation had built the exact foundation Eric needed to execute his theft. Arthur did not ask for my forgiveness, and I did not offer it. The old man simply nodded his head, pulled the small black token from his suit pocket, and slid it across the glass table toward Lena. He quietly agreed to surrender all of his corporate devices for a full forensic extraction, finally choosing the truth over his family name. Eric was already panicking, leaving a trail of desperate mistakes in his wake. Lena pulled up an internal technology support ticket generated early this morning, just hours after the massive insurance claim was officially flagged for review. The system log documented a frantic phone call from my husband to the corporate help desk. He had demanded that a technician permanently delete the document history for the beneficiary portal, claiming a duplicate upload was cluttering his client files. The technician had firmly refused the suspicious request, citing the strict data retention policy of the financial institution. The recorded ticket proved Eric was actively trying to destroy the evidence after the fact. It was the frantic flailing of a man who suddenly realized the doors were locking from the outside. The preservation notices Maya had sent the previous day were finally returning massive yields of concrete information. Escrow records arrived from the title company via secure courier, detailing the exact financial structure of the coastal property. The documents confirmed the $8,000 test transfer I had noticed 2 weeks prior. My husband had successfully moved the money, panicked when I emailed him demanding an explanation, and reversed the transaction to avoid a larger argument. Then, while a hospital coordinator begged for that exact amount to authorize a surgical transport for his own flesh and blood, he sent the money right back to the escrow account to cover the final cash to close. But the absolute most chilling document in the stack was the commercial bridge loan application. Vanessa had secured the short-term financing for the beach house by listing additional collateral to guarantee the massive loan. Right there, on page 4 of the application, under a section labeled Anticipated Insurance Proceeds, was a slightly abbreviated policy number. It perfectly matched the life insurance contract belonging to my daughter. A cold wave washed over me, freezing the air in my lungs and turning the blood in my veins to ice. They had listed the death payout as a funding source weeks before the accident ever happened. The chilling discovery raised a horrifying question. I did not know whether my husband had somehow anticipated a tragedy, or if he simply viewed the policy as a dormant financial asset he intended to cash out by any means necessary once the divorce began. Either way, he had placed a distinct monetary value on her life while she was still breathing. The conference room phone buzzed sharply, breaking the heavy silence and making Arthur flinch in his chair. Lena picked up the receiver, listening intently for a few seconds before her posture straightened and her eyes widened slightly. The technology department had just recovered an automated server backup from the night of the accident. They found a deleted folder on his local drive, the investigator announced, her voice tight with disbelief as she looked across the table at me. It contains the original draft of the forged document. The file is titled Chloe Beneficiary Final. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, my heart hammering a brutal, unrelenting rhythm against my ribs. What time was the file created? Lena stared directly into my eyes, sliding the freshly printed forensic report across the smooth glass. 17 minutes after the overseas hospital called to notify him of her death. The chilling timeline hung in the sterile conference room air. 17 minutes. That was all the time my husband needed to transition from a grieving father into a calculated thief. Arthur stared at the frosted glass table, his face draining of color until his skin matched the pale gray walls. The old man suddenly looked incredibly frail, practically shrinking inside his expensive tailored suit. He cleared his throat twice before confessing the rest of his dangerous secret. Arthur admitted the corporate executive phone lines were automatically recorded for compliance purposes. He had pulled the audio log immediately after receiving the internal audit alert regarding the life insurance policy. But he had deliberately sliced the file before putting it on the small black drive he handed me at the funeral. My father-in-law had cut the recording short to protect his lucrative company from a massive public scandal. He wanted me to know the truth, but he still valued his corporate legacy far more than the life of his own granddaughter. Maya leaned forward, her leather chair groaning under the sudden shift in weight. My attorney did not yell. She simply informed Arthur that his edited drive was completely legally useless and demanded the untouched server original through a formal subpoena. The old man nodded silently, agreeing to grant the investigators full access without a fight. 2 hours later, we relocated to a windowless security office on the 4th floor. Lena Brooks sat at a heavy metal desk, typing her credentials into a restricted terminal. The room smelled strongly of ozone and burnt dust from the humming server racks lining the back wall. Maya stood beside my chair, placing a steady hand on my shoulder as the audio file loaded onto the screen. We were going to listen to the entire unedited conversation, pulling the raw data directly from the corporate archive. A sharp hiss of static filled the small room, followed by the familiar, echoing chaos of the overseas emergency ward. The Portuguese hospital coordinator spoke first. Her voice sounded exactly as I remembered from the edited drive, clipped and tightly coiled with professional panic. She detailed the massive internal bleeding, explaining the narrow window for a surgical transfer, and explicitly requesting a security deposit equivalent to $8,000. Eric answered her. His voice flowed through the overhead speakers, perfectly clear and remarkably calm. He confirmed that he understood the severity. The man did not ask a single question about Chloe's pain levels, nor did he request to speak with a doctor. He simply asked if the required transfer could wait until the following morning. Then, a new sound surfaced in the background of the audio track, A woman sighed heavily, the sharp click of high heels tapping impatiently against a hardwood floor. Vanessa was standing right next to him. The environmental noise captured the distinct rustle of heavy paper and the slide of a leather binder. They were sitting inside the escrow office, reviewing the final closing documents for the coastal investment property. My fingernails dug deeply into the fabric of my uniform trousers. I forced myself to keep breathing, counting the steady rhythm of the server fans to keep my chest from completely collapsing. The hospital coordinator refused his request for a delay, her accent thickening with obvious frustration. She explained that the local facility lacked the equipment to keep the young patient stable overnight. "Sir, you must understand the strict timeline here," the woman pleaded. "If we do not move her to surgery immediately, by morning, your daughter may be dead." A terrible, heavy silence followed her warning. I watched the digital timer on the screen tick forward. 3 seconds. 5 seconds, 8 seconds. My husband was weighing the cost of his child against the deed to a beach house. "Then by morning, it may not matter," Eric said. The words hit my stomach like a physical blow. The air completely rushed out of my lungs, leaving me gasping in the cold room. Before the horror could fully register, Vanessa leaned closer to the phone receiver. Her voice came through crisp and utterly devoid of empathy. "Tell them the transfer is coming," the mistress whispered. "We only need them to hold off until the closing clears." Eric repeated her exact instructions to the hospital staff, promising a wire transfer he had absolutely no intention of sending. He actively used his words to pin my daughter to a dying bed, just to secure his real estate timeline. I stood up so fast my metal chair crashed backward onto the linoleum floor. The security room suddenly felt suffocatingly small, the walls pressing inward. Maya reached out, but I pushed past her and walked blindly into the hallway. I pressed my forehead against the cool cinder-block wall, my vision swimming with dark spots. Bile rose in the back of my throat. I stood there for 5 full minutes, letting the violent nausea pass, gripping the metal handrail until my hands stopped shaking. Running away would not finish the mission. I turned around, walked back into the room, and righted my fallen chair. "Play the rest of it," I told Lena. The investigator gave me a quiet nod of respect and clicked the play button again. The call with the hospital ended shortly after Eric delivered his false promise. But the corporate recording system did not immediately disconnect. The digital log showed my husband initiating a second call less than a minute later. He dialed an internal extension. A cheerful customer service representative answered the line. Eric provided his employee identification number and requested the current status of the life insurance policy assigned to his dependent. He specifically asked the representative to confirm the exact payout amount and the current beneficiary designations. He checked the money before he ever picked up the phone to tell me our child was gone. The timeline completely unraveled his perfect grieving father routine. 20 minutes after inquiring about the $250,000 payout, Eric finally called my military command post. That was the call where he sobbed hysterically, claiming the hospital had given him absolutely no time to arrange the funds. The 2 recorded versions of my husband existed side by side in the digital archive, destroying every single defense he could possibly mount. Lena paused the audio file, the heavy silence returning to the room. Maya crossed her arms, looking down at the scattered notes on the desk. "We have the entire chain of custody," the attorney said quietly. "We have the metadata, the escrow timeline, and his own recorded voice. If you want to end his public sympathy tour right now, we can leak this transcript to his entire family before dinner." I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. The smear campaign was still actively burning through my notifications. Eric's mother had just posted another lengthy update, thanking her friends for supporting her son while he bravely dealt with an unhinged, greedy spouse. Several relatives had left angry comments, demanding to know how a mother could abandon her family during a tragedy. They were painting him as a saint and me as a monster. The temptation to release the audio and watch his carefully crafted world burn to ash was incredibly strong. But leaking the evidence early would give his defense lawyers a massive advantage. They would claim the recording was obtained illegally, or they would coach Vanessa to change her story and claim I had manipulated the files. I refused to give him a single legal loophole. "No," I said, dropping my phone back into my pocket. "I want them to hear it where he cannot call it gossip. We hold the audio for the official proceedings." Maya offered a small, fierce smile. She understood exactly what I was building. This was not a chaotic emotional reaction. It was a calculated siege. Over the next 3 days, Eric continued to operate under the arrogant assumption that he was winning the war. He organized a small, highly curated memorial gathering at a local country club, inviting his wealthy clients and most influential relatives. I did not attend, remaining securely inside my brick apartment while Maya monitored the situation through her legal contacts. According to the reports we received, Eric stood by an expensive floral arrangement and delivered a heartbreaking speech about the heavy burden of moving forward. He quietly told his guests that I was mentally unwell, struggling to process reality, and acting erratically with our shared finances. He planted the seeds for his next legal maneuver, claiming he might need to petition the court for emergency control over my assets to protect me from my own grief. He truly believed I was sitting alone in a cheap apartment, crying over old photographs and lacking the strength to fight back. He had no idea the doors were already locked. On Thursday afternoon, the weather shifted into a bitter, freezing rain that pelted the small window in my kitchen. I was sitting at the table updating the final pages of my continuity binder when Maya called my personal line. Her voice hummed with a sharp, electric energy that instantly grabbed my attention. "Lena just finalized the internal review at the insurance firm," Maya announced, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing in the background. "The fraud department officially froze the claim. Your husband will receive a certified denial notice within the hour." A deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill of the rainy afternoon. Does he know the specific reason for the freeze? "The letter cites discrepancies in the digital signature and suspicious upload timestamps," Maya replied. "But that is not the best part of the day. The bridge lender for the coastal property just issued a critical warning." Vanessa had used the anticipated insurance payout to secure the massive short-term loan for the beach house. With the death claim officially flagged for fraud, the lender's automated risk system had immediately panicked. Maya explained that the financial institution had just sent a severe legal notice directly to Eric and Vanessa. The lender demanded formal proof of an alternative repayment source, and they gave my husband exactly 72 hours to produce the funds or face an immediate default on the property. The financial vice was finally closing. Eric had built his entire future on the assumption that the insurance money would quietly arrive and cover his tracks. Now, the escrow account was empty, the bridge loan was collapsing, and his corporate safety net was completely compromised by the server audit. "He is going to panic when he reads those notices," I said, closing my heavy binder and locking the brass clasp. "Yes, he is," Maya agreed, her tone shifting into a serious, protective warning. "He needs a signature from you. To unfreeze that claim, he needs you to officially confirm that Chloe wanted him to have the money. Without your sworn statement, he loses the house and the payout." I looked toward the heavy deadbolt on my apartment door, listening to the freezing rain hammer against the exterior brick. The trap was fully sprung, and the prey was completely out of options. "Keep your doors locked," Maya instructed quietly. "Now he is going to come to you." The bitter freezing rain continued to lash against the brick exterior of my apartment building, turning the streetlights into blurred smears of amber against the dark, wet asphalt. I sat perfectly still at my small dining table, the heavy silence of the room punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of icy droplets against the glass. Maya was right. The walls were closing in on my husband. And a cornered man is always at his most dangerous when he finally realizes he has lost the ability to control the narrative. Heavy, deliberate thuds against the front door shattered the quiet. My heart skipped a single beat before settling into a steady, cold rhythm. I did not rush to the entryway. I stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and checked the small security monitor I had mounted beside the refrigerator. The building hallway was empty, but the camera mounted near the stairwell showed Eric standing on the landing. His dark coat was soaked through, plastered to his shoulders by the storm, and his hair hung in wet, jagged clumps over his forehead. He did not look like the grieving father who had commanded the attention of the country club memorial gathering 3 days prior. He looked like a man who had finally realized his foundation was dissolving into mud. I walked to the door, left the heavy deadbolt firmly engaged, and spoke through the wood. "Go home, Eric." His fists pounded against the door again, the sound echoing like a hollow drum in the small entryway. "Open the door, Danny. Stop hiding in this pathetic hole and act like an adult." "I am an adult who is finished being managed," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of the tremor he was searching for. "You have nothing to say that I want to hear." "We need to save Chloe's legacy," he shouted, his tone shifting into a shrill, desperate register I had never heard before. The insurance company flagged the claim. "They think there is a problem with the digital signature. I need you to sign a simple statement for them. Just one sentence confirming that she wanted me to have the payout. That is all it takes to make this nightmare disappear." I leaned my forehead against the cool, solid surface of the door, listening to the frantic desperation dripping from his words. He was not asking for a favor. He was begging for the final piece of a fraud. "Why do you need my confirmation if she already signed the forms you submitted?" The silence from the hallway stretched out for 5 agonizing seconds. I could hear him gasping for air, the sound of his ragged breathing amplified by the proximity of the wood. "The signature is not enough anymore," he admitted, his voice cracking. "They need a sworn affidavit from the next of kin. They need you to verify the intent." He was losing his grip on the life he had stolen. I stayed silent, letting the weight of his own explanations settle between us. "You know why the signature is not enough," Eric shouted. "I only used the old signature because she was not there to sign the new form." My hand tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter. "Not there?" I asked. "Or no longer alive?" The hallway went silent. "You know what I mean," he muttered. I did not press him for another answer. I did not feed him information or try to lead him into saying anything else. The camera had captured the words he had chosen on his own. "This conversation is over," I said. "You have no idea what you started," Eric replied. "I will tell the army you were never there for your daughter. I will tell them you cared more about your rank than her emergency calls. I will destroy your reputation before the sun comes up." The apartment, my finances, and every decision I made were documented by my attorney months before Chloe died, I said. "You cannot rewrite that timeline." He leaned his weight against the door. "Just one sentence, Danny. One sentence saves everything. Tell them you saw her sign the document." I rested my hand on the deadbolt. "One sentence was all the hospital needed from you." I did not wait for his reaction. I turned around and walked back toward the kitchen, my movements fluid and determined. Through the small window, I heard him strike the door one final time, a heavy, defeated thud of skin against wood, before his boots began to retreat down the concrete stairs. He was gone, but the storm was far from over. The hallway remained empty for exactly 3 minutes. Then, the lobby security system alerted me to the presence of the building manager and a pair of uniformed police officers. They arrived to escort the man off the property, but by the time they reached the landing, he had already vanished into the rainy night. They knocked on my door, their voices professional and concerned, asking if I was safe. I opened the door just a few inches, speaking with them briefly to confirm my safety, and provided the necessary information for their incident report. They took my statement, reviewed the time-stamped footage from the lobby, and filed the report under harassment and trespassing. The digital evidence was preserved in the cloud, linked to Maya's account, and officially logged for the upcoming hearing. I closed the door and slid the deadbolt home. The apartment felt different now. The tension that had defined my life for the last 10 months had finally shifted from a hidden, internal burden to a tangible, external conflict. My husband was running out of time and resources, and the desperation he displayed at my door was only the beginning of his unraveling. Maya called less than an hour later. The building manager had transferred the original hallway footage directly to her office, preserving the file without requiring me to copy or alter it. The recording captured Eric's threat against my military career and his admission that he had used Chloe's old signature because she was not there to sign. "The footage is being preserved with the incident report," Maya said. "Do not download another copy or send it to anyone." Before the call ended, an email arrived from the bridge lender. Eric had failed to provide a valid source of funds, and the lender had begun the formal default process against the coastal property. A second call appeared on my screen. Lena Brooks. I placed Maya on hold and answered. "Vanessa Cole contacted me from a parking lot," Lena said. "Eric told her Arthur would take the blame because the token was registered in his name. He also intends to claim Vanessa formed the limited liability company and submitted the false documents without his knowledge. He is preparing to sacrifice both of them," I said. "Yes," Lena replied. "Vanessa finally understands that. What does she want?" Lena paused. Her first words were, "I have the phone he told me to destroy." Vanessa sat in the back corner of the small, sterile interview room, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had posed in the beach house renderings. Her mascara was smeared, and her hands shook violently as she placed a heavy, older model smartphone onto the metal table between us. It was the device Eric had explicitly ordered her to destroy the night he realized his claim was going to be frozen. Lena Brooks stood near the door, her notepad ready. Vanessa did not look at the investigator, nor did she acknowledge my presence in the room. She only stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake she had finally managed to trap. "I am not going to prison for him," Vanessa whispered, her voice cracking with a mix of terror and raw resentment. "He told me the insurance money was a sure thing. He swore he knew how to move the funds without leaving a trace." "You knew the funds were tied to a death claim," Lena stated, her tone devoid of judgment but heavy with authority. "You knew the money was coming from a girl who was still alive when you started the beach house paperwork." Vanessa flinched at the blunt phrasing, but she did not deny the accusation. She admitted that she had provided false statements to the bridge lender, describing the $8,000 as her own independent capital when she knew it had been funneled from my family's emergency savings. She was desperate to negotiate a deal, begging for immunity in exchange for her full cooperation. Lena offered nothing but the standard assurance that the prosecutor would be informed of her assistance, a far cry from the safety she had hoped to purchase. The phone logs extracted that afternoon contained enough digital evidence to bury my husband 10 times over. Messages between the two of them showed Eric growing increasingly erratic as the lender's deadline approached. He had instructed her to get rid of the beneficiary page, explicitly commanding her to destroy the old version that had my name on it. Vanessa had sent back photos of the beach house, mocking my ignorance, and declaring that Chloe's policy would finally provide the financial leverage we could never have achieved on our own. The messages proved that Eric and Vanessa had treated Chloe's policy as a potential source of money before the accident, but they did not prove that either of them had expected her to die. What they did prove was that once tragedy came, they were prepared to exploit it. I watched the screen as the investigator scrolled through the timeline of their correspondence. My husband had been treating my daughter's life insurance like a pending lottery win, planning his retirement and his new life while I was still driving her to school and helping her pack for Portugal. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs until every breath became a labor. Arthur arrived at the headquarters shortly after our meeting with Vanessa concluded. He had been summoned by the legal team to answer for his role in the unauthorized server access. My father-in-law did not attempt to shift the blame onto anyone else. He sat at the long table, his face etched with a deep, weary sorrow, as he confessed to ignoring the early warnings about Eric's activities. He admitted that he had heard the audio recording of that fatal hospital call, and instead of calling the authorities, he had consulted his own corporate lawyers to protect the firm from the fallout. "I failed her," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he looked directly at me. "I protected the company, and because I waited, he had the time to upload the forged document." I did not offer him absolution. I simply watched him sign his formal confession, the pen moving across the page with an agonizingly slow, rhythmic grace. His resignation from the board of directors would be public knowledge by morning. It was a necessary step, but it could not bring back what we had lost. Eric did not go down without one final, pathetic attempt to rally the family. He called a meeting with his siblings, frantically trying to rewrite the narrative one last time. He claimed that Vanessa had acted entirely on her own, inventing the entire insurance fraud scheme to frame him, and that Arthur had suffered a mental breakdown that caused him to imagine the hospital recording. It was a masterful display of narcissism, an attempt to throw every single person who had ever supported him under the bus just to save his own freedom. His plan backfired spectacularly. One of his cousins, a woman I had always kept a polite distance from, sent me a screenshot of their group text. Eric had demanded they all sign a document swearing he was never at the beach house office during the hospital call. His cousin had replied with a simple, devastating message. "I was there with you, Eric, and I saw Vanessa holding your phone." The facade was finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. Several weeks passed while investigators authenticated Vanessa's phone, traced the bank and escrow records, examined the corporate servers, and prepared the affidavits required for search warrants. I received updates through Maya, but there were no dramatic arrests and no instant verdicts. Every device and record had to be collected through the proper process. After the warrants were approved, federal agents arrived at Eric's office during a morning meeting. They seized his corporate laptop, his personal devices, and the records identified in the warrant. A grand jury returned the formal indictment after reviewing the resulting evidence, beginning a legal process that would continue for months. He was not handcuffed in public, but he was escorted out of the building with the quiet, crushing certainty of a man who had finally lost his grip on reality. I stood on the other side of the street, watching his silhouette pass through the glass doors of the lobby. He did not look for me. He did not look anywhere at all. That night, my attorney called to confirm that the prosecutor had received the full case file. The evidence was absolute, and the timeline was sealed. "He has reached out to a high-profile defense firm," Maya told me, her voice guarded. "They are going to try a plea deal, but they have a very specific strategy in mind." "What is the strategy?" I asked, my grip tightening on the receiver. Maya hesitated for a moment before answering. "They are going to argue that you knew everything from the beginning. They are going to claim that you stood by and allowed the fraud to happen so you could be the one to orchestrate his downfall. They are going to try to turn you into the villain." I looked around my quiet, empty apartment, the space that had become my fortress of truth. Let them try. Every lie they tell just makes the truth easier to see. The defense team's strategy felt like a final, desperate attempt to rewrite reality. Standing in the cold, cavernous courtroom, I watched Eric's lawyers spin a narrative that painted my meticulous preparation as a grand underlying conspiracy. They argued that my decision to lease a separate apartment and maintain a detailed binder of financial records proved I had been planning to orchestrate his downfall long before the accident occurred. They looked at the jurors with practiced sincerity, suggesting that a dedicated, intelligent officer like me would never have been blindsided by such a scheme. They wanted the jury to believe that my foresight was not a survival tactic, but a premeditated weapon used to frame a man they described as a loving, albeit flawed, husband. Their words stung, Every moment I had spent carefully building my exit plan, every hour of documenting the financial inconsistencies, and every night I had spent in fear were being twisted into proof of my own cold-blooded betrayal. I looked toward the defense table, but my husband refused to meet my gaze. He stared straight ahead, his posture stiff, projecting the image of a man suffering under the weight of a false accusation. The unfairness of the situation pressed against my chest, but I maintained a stoic posture. Maya sat beside me, her presence a silent, immovable anchor against the tide of their misrepresentations. Your Honor, the defense asserts that the defendant's actions were born of a desperate need to protect his family, the lead attorney stated, gesturing toward Eric with an open palm. His wife's decision to move into a secret apartment and track his every movement created a hostile environment that left him vulnerable to outside influences. I felt Maya shift slightly, her pen gliding across her notepad. She did not object, but her silence was strategic. They were building their own trap. The prosecution called me to the stand, and I walked to the wooden box with a heavy, steady tread. The oath felt like a weight, grounding me in the reality I had fought so hard to document. I answered each question clearly, sticking to the timeline I had preserved for months. When the defense attorney rose to cross-examine me, he jumped immediately into the apartment timeline. He questioned why I had felt it necessary to move out, implying that my departure had abandoned my daughter in her hour of need. I paused, feeling the weight of Chloe's memory, and then I spoke, my voice ringing clear throughout the chamber. I chose to lease the apartment after discovering multiple financial irregularities that suggested our family savings were being compromised without my knowledge. I never abandoned my daughter. I established a base where I could protect our future when it became clear that my husband was prioritizing his financial interests over our family's stability. The defense attorney scoffed, shifting his papers. And you have records of these so-called irregularities, I presume? I have every record, I replied. I kept a binder documenting every transaction, every inquiry, and every decision I made regarding my own finances and the protection of my family. The prosecution eventually introduced the emergency contact emails. The digital logs displayed my careful instructions to Eric, including the specific emergency operational desk number I had provided. I watched the jurors lean forward as the assistant district attorney highlighted the time-stamped emails that predated the accident by several weeks. Eric had never once dialed that number. He had never reached out to my command for help. The narrative that I was an absent mother disappeared the moment the jury saw the clear, documented proof that I had provided every possible channel for him to save our child. The courtroom remained deathly quiet when Lena Brooks finally authenticated the full audio recording. The defense team tried to block the playback, claiming it was prejudicial and lacked context, but the judge overruled the objection. The recording filled the room, sounding even more chilling in the open, public space than it had in the private security office. When the audio reached the point where the hospital coordinator warned that Chloe might die by morning, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt thin and electrified. Eric's mother lowered her head, her hands covering her mouth, while a woman sitting in the front row, someone I recognized as a former neighbor, quietly wiped tears from her eyes. When the recording concluded with my husband's decision to prioritize the escrow funds over our daughter's life, he finally looked toward the back of the room, his face pale and drained of all color. Vanessa's testimony followed the next day. She looked exhausted, her usual confidence completely stripped away by the reality of the criminal charges. She confirmed under oath that she had worked with Eric to forge the beneficiary form, describing how he had used the corporate scanner to layer my daughter's signature onto the new document. She spoke of the pressure he had applied to her, the demands he had made regarding the destruction of the phone, and the clear, unambiguous plan they had shared to pay off the bridge loan using the insurance proceeds. Did he ever show any sign of remorse after the accident? The prosecutor asked. Vanessa looked at Eric, who was staring fixedly at the floor. He told me not to worry. He told me the claim would be processed before anyone realized what had happened. He only cared about the house. Arthur followed, his testimony proving to be the final turning point for the jury. He confirmed his own failure to act, taking full responsibility for allowing his son to misuse the corporate security token. His words were not an attempt to save Eric, but an admission of his own complicity in the culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish. He confirmed the audit logs, the timeline of the deleted documents, and the reality of Eric's obsession with the financial payout. The defense attorney attempted to cross-examine Arthur, trying to suggest that an elderly, distraught father might be confused about the technical details of the server logs, but the old man remained firm. He pointed toward the digital exhibit board, his voice steady. "I saw the logs. I saw the access times. I know what he did." As the proceedings moved into their final phase, the prosecutor placed a time-limited plea offer on the defense table. If Eric rejected it and proceeded to a full trial, he would face additional charges connected to the forged insurance form, the unauthorized system access, the attempted destruction of evidence, and the other client files uncovered during the forensic review. Eric asked through his attorney whether I would speak to the prosecutor on his behalf. Maya delivered my answer without changing a word. "I will not ask for punishment out of anger," I said. "But I will not lie to reduce the consequences of what he chose to do." The plea hearing took place several days later. Eric stood before the judge and admitted that he had created the false beneficiary form, copied Chloe's signature from an older document, and used Arthur's hardware token without permission. His voice remained low as he tried to describe his actions as mistakes made during a moment of panic. The prosecutor stepped closer to the lectern. "You were notified that your daughter had died before you created the final beneficiary file, correct?" Eric stared at the table in front of him. "Yes. The server records show that the file was created 17 minutes after that notification. Do you dispute that timestamp?" His shoulders dropped. "No." That single word did what months of excuses could not. Eric confirmed the timeline with his own voice. He pleaded guilty to multiple fraud counts, unauthorized access to protected records, and obstruction of justice in exchange for a sentencing recommendation of 9 years. Vanessa entered a separate plea agreement carrying a recommendation of 3 years because of her cooperation, but she was still required to admit her role in the forged document, the false loan statements, and the attempt to destroy evidence. The court appointed an independent receiver to take control of the coastal property. The house would be sold, the lender would be paid according to the court's order, and neither Eric nor Vanessa would receive the future they had tried to build with Chloe's policy. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later. The evening before the hearing, a padded envelope from Maya arrived at my apartment. Inside was a small memory card containing the final voice message Chloe had recorded from the ambulance. I had heard the first sentence before, but never the last 12 seconds. I sat at my dining table, placed the card into my laptop, and pressed play. Chloe's voice emerged, faint and shaky, yet carrying a resilient, unmistakable sweetness that had always defined her spirit. She was breathing hard, the background noise filled with the chaotic, metallic grinding of the rescue team working against the wreckage of the transport vehicle. She sounded terrified, yet her mind was focused on the one person she trusted above all else. "Mom, I think Dad is fixing it," she murmured, her voice trailing off into a soft, wheezing sigh. She believed he was coming to save her. She believed her father was the man who would always show up, the hero of her childhood who would set everything right. I listened until the very end of the file, hearing the final 12 seconds of her consciousness. It was not a recording of despair, it was a testament to a child's absolute, tragic faith in a parent who had already decided her life was an unnecessary expense. I did not replay the file. I sat in the dim light of the apartment, letting the sound fade into the quiet, and then I placed the card back into its protective case. It was no longer a weapon of war. It was simply the truth. The morning of the sentencing hearing brought a cold, persistent drizzle that mirrored the day of the funeral. I walked into the courtroom, my movements measured and calm, taking my seat behind the prosecutor's table. Eric sat in the defendant's chair, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the scarred wooden floorboards. He looked diminished, a shadow of the man who had commanded the attention of everyone in the room only a few months ago. His lawyers sat beside him, their expressions neutral, their defense having already collapsed under the sheer weight of the audit logs and the audio evidence. The judge opened the session with a solemn request for any final statements. I stood up, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor as I moved toward the witness stand. I did not look at the defense table. I kept my gaze forward, focusing on the heavy mahogany benches that represented the authority of the law. My statement was not a plea for vengeance. I spoke of the man who had systematically weaponized every aspect of our family's security, from our private savings and our child's future to the integrity of his father's company. I spoke of the choice he made in that hospital room, a choice that had cost him his integrity and had cost our daughter everything. I did not ask the court for a specific number of years, but I asked for the record to reflect that his actions were not born of panic, but of a calculated, cold-hearted pursuit of his own financial gain. When I finished, I sat down, the courtroom descending into a profound, suffocating silence. The judge looked toward Eric, offering him a final chance to address the court. He stood, his voice barely rising above a whisper. He spoke of the pressure he felt, the weight of the corporate expectations, and the mistakes he had made under the influence of his own distorted ambitions. He did not say her name. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stood there, a man stripped of his titles and his house, waiting for the gavel to seal his fate. The judge sentenced Eric to 9 years, citing the fraud, the obstruction, the unauthorized access to protected records, and the deliberate exploitation of his daughter's death. In a separate hearing later that afternoon, Vanessa received 3 years. Her cooperation reduced her exposure, but it did not erase her role in the forgery, the false loan documents, or the attempt to destroy evidence. As the bailiffs approached, Eric turned toward me for the first time that morning. "You destroyed my life," he said. I stood without moving closer to him. "No, I documented what you did with it." The bailiffs led him through the side door. The heavy metal door closed behind him with one final sound, separating the excuses he had built from the record he could no longer change. I walked out of the building into the cool, damp air of the afternoon, the weight of the past year finally lifting from my shoulders. The coastal house had been sold under court order, the proceeds helping to restore the stolen funds and satisfy the restitution demands. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the drizzle touch my face, finally feeling as though the air could reach the bottom of my lungs. My work was not finished, but it had changed. The Chloe Whitaker Emergency Passage Fund was operational, officially launched with the funds I had managed to secure through the legal process. I returned to my apartment and checked the administrative portal for the foundation. A new request had arrived, flagging a military family stationed in a remote sector who were struggling to secure medical transport for an injured child. The costs were significant, the urgency absolute. The staff member handling the case pinged me on the secure line, asking if I wanted to follow the standard protocol for board approval, or if I would authorize the funds immediately. I thought of the 12 seconds of audio I had kept, the sound of my daughter's voice, trusting her father to make things right. I reached for my keyboard, my pulse steady and deliberate. "No," I typed, the words appearing on the screen with perfect clarity. "The emergency authorization is already in place. Send it now." I pressed enter and watched the confirmation status change to completed. $8,000 reached the hospital before the call ended. Less than 2 minutes later, the secure line rang. "Transfer received," the coordinator said. "The transport team is moving the child to the operating room now." I closed my eyes and let those words settle inside me. Eric had used $8,000 to buy a house he would never own. Chloe's fund had used the same amount to make sure another family would not have to bury a child. I placed the continuity binder on the highest shelf and closed the cabinet. This time, the money arrived before it was too late, but the most dangerous lies often hide behind the familiar comfort of a long marriage. You must learn that protecting your future is not an act of paranoia. It is an act of necessity. True partnership requires transparency, and when that is replaced by secrets or financial control, you have a fundamental right to demand the truth. Never mistake silence for peace, and never let anyone make you feel ashamed for keeping your own records or maintaining your personal independence. You are the only person who can truly safeguard your own path, and preparing for the worst does not mean you have lost faith in the people you love. It simply means you are responsible enough to hold them accountable. When the facade finally crumbles, your evidence will be the only thing that stands between your survival and your complete destruction. Have you ever felt the quiet, cold warning of a secret growing in your own home? And if so, did you have the courage to ask the questions that needed to be answered before it was too late?